Good afternoon. This is Suk-Jung Lee from South Korea, and I'm honored to introduce Michael Green. Actually, he doesn't need any introduction to everyone here, I'm sure. And still, for the matter of formality, if I just say about his major accomplishment, he's leading, I think he's a vice president for Asia and Japan chair at CSIS. And before he moved to CSIS, I think everybody knows he served the National Security Council, and also he advised many government bureaucracies, including DOD and many other agencies. And also he, I think, led the study team at the CFR on U.S.-Japan alliance, and also independent study group on Korea as well. And also he taught at SAIS as a professor. So he has a kind of academic background and later turning to more joining the policy circle. And in the region, Michael is known to be Asianist, starting from Japan expert. I think many of us read his excellent book, Japan's Reluctant Realism, and also Arming Japan, two of many of them. And when I read in August last year, he was one of GOP national security experts who signed up the letter that he's not going to vote for Mr. Trump. So maybe that's a reason why this administration is lacking excellent Asian analysts like Michael Green. But that gives us more fabulous opportunities to hear his opinion about this government Asia policy. So without further ado, let's welcome Michael Green.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Richard, and thanks to Brookings and all the co-sponsors for this conference, which is very well timed, in addition to having a very distinguished participation from across the region. I was not able to join the government because I signed a letter criticizing our current president. But the good news is that means I have time to be with you today. Washington is a very tribal place, and for Republicans or conservative independents who worked for George W. Bush or Ronald Reagan, this is a very confusing and difficult time. And a lot of people have made before the election their own choices about what they were going to do when Donald Trump ran, because he essentially ran against everything that the established foreign policy elite of both parties stood for. And by the way, in my view, what most of the country stands for, but I'll come back to that. And people made different choices. I signed a letter last August with a total of 50 senior Bush administration officials, but there were other letters as well. Some people held their fire because they wanted to go in. There weren't that many of those. Some people held their fire because they worked in the Congress for a company and were not able to sign it. Some signed the letters and regret it. I'm not one of those. But I'm not a resistor. I mean, and I don't think most people who worked in the Bush and Reagan administrations none really are resistors. I liked very much what the Ohio governor, John Kasich, said after he met the president in the White House, and the media asked him, how could you meet this president who you said would be so bad and who you criticized and said you wouldn't vote for? And Governor Kasich said, when you're on a plane, you basically root for the pilot. And that's basically my attitude. Talking about the Trump administration in Asia, to be honest, in a non-sophisticated setting like the Brookings Institution, when I'm at home with my wife or playing tennis with my brother, all we talk about is who's up, who's down, how big will Ivanka Trump's office in the West Wing be. And admit it, Richard, I know that's what you do all the time too when you're not in such an august setting. But at times like this, I take enormous emotional and intellectual refuge in history. And with encouragement from Warren Cohen, although you don't have to own it, Warren, and others, and Richard, I started a book almost a decade ago on the history of U.S. strategy in Asia, which is now out on Amazon, called By More Than Providence, and it's a history of American grand strategy. So as I have tried to understand and explain the Trump administration's Asia policy, that has been an enormous source of intellectual rigor and satisfaction trying to make sense of what's happening right now. And at Georgetown, where I'm also a professor, I teach courses on East Asian international relations and on Asian leaders. And in the leaders class, I say to the students, there are two things that define international relations, really. One is structure, the structure of domestic institutions, international institutions, distribution of power, which is what political scientists almost exclusively focus on. And then there's agency, which is the personalities and individuals, and especially of leaders. And up until November, I told my students, we Asianists need to pay a lot more attention to agency. Now I'm telling them structure. We Asianists need to pay a lot more attention to structure. So let me say a little bit about agency and a lot about structure, especially drawing from history, which does not repeat, of course, but is instructive. And let me focus on one of the most dramatic, traumatic, and revealing episodes in President Trump's approach to Asia. And in particular, his views on and policy towards what I view as the two pillars of modern American strategy in Asia. And those two pillars are the 1951 San Francisco Treaty System, the alliances that we negotiated in San Francisco with Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and the Philippines, and then later with Korea, Republic of China, and then Thailand. And the second pillar is our One China policy, which grew out of President Nixon's first communique, but essentially has been honored by every American president since Jimmy Carter, normalized relations. So these really are, it's embedded within the UN system. It's embedded within America's market and democracy and our military power and the Bretton Woods systems. But on a regional basis, these are the pillars of American influence, strategy, reliability in Asia. Our treaty system from 1951 and our One China policy. And that's why it's so interesting, because Donald Trump attacked them both. Now, Ronald Reagan, when he ran for president, attacked One China policy and briefly flirted with, largely without positive gain, flirted with normalizing relations with Taiwan. And to some extent, Bill Clinton came in and attacked Japan as a free rider. But never before in our history has a candidate come in and attacked both of these major pillars. That says to me a lot more about agency than structure. Why did Donald Trump attack these two pillars of American leadership? I think two reasons. One, this was clearly an anti-establishment populist campaign, and in effect, anything that the East and West Coast elite was for, he was against. So there's a certain demand, which is not strategy and it's not policy, it's emotions and sort of trying to capture the mood of the country. And the other reason is that Mr. Trump's success so far has been based, I think in his view, has been based on his ability to negotiate. And how does he negotiate? Well, he goes into a negotiation with an absolutely maximalist position. Whatever the person on the other side of the table wants, he starts out by telling them they can't have, and they're going to have to pay for it. That has worked for him. A consequence of that is that no bank will lend him money now except Deutsche Bank, and no major U.S. business leader will do business with him again. But it worked quite successfully for him, and it worked quite well for him as a candidate. And so the other reason, of course, is that's the sort of art of the negotiator, America will get tired of winning reason for his presidency and for his own personal success. And so he took to the Japanese and to the Chinese and the Koreans the thing that matters most to them from the U.S., these pillars. And then he changed his mind. He changed his mind within, maybe he was bluffing. Maybe he had intended to bluff all along, but he changed his policy certainly within 72, 48 hours, when he spoke with Xi Jinping on the telephone and confirmed our One China policy for the first time since declaring that it was on the table. And then about a day later met with Prime Minister Abe Shinzo of Japan and confirmed in a written statement prepared by the Foreign Ministry of Japan. As a former NSC guy, to me this is, I was in Tokyo a few weeks ago and the Foreign Ministry was giddy and terrified at the same time. But he confirmed not only our security commitment, but our security commitment to areas administered by Japan, which means Senkaku, Diaoyuda. So the litmus test for Japanese political leaders of the American commitment, he went right to it in very concrete terms and read it. So why did he switch? Well, some people are speculating about agency. Secretary Tillerson got through, the president said, you cannot, manage Asia unless you reaffirm the One China policy. Secretary Mattis went to Japan and Korea and stated unequivocally that our Article 5 commitment to Japan under the 1960 Security Treaty, the revised treaty, applies to the Senkakus. So, other cabinet members perhaps sort of pushed the president to it. Some people speculate, not without reason, that Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner were key in this. Jared Kushner, because of his constant dialogue with Ambassador Sui Tangkai, the Chinese ambassador in Washington, and Ivanka Trump through connections to Japan she has. It was Ivanka Trump who convinced the president, I am told by people who were there, to read the statement on Japan, and Jared Kushner had a clear role on the China policy. I joked when I was in Japan and China 2 weeks ago that as long as Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump have a good marriage, then the U.S. China-Japan trilateral relationship should be stable. We should be the think tanks should be having policy recommendations for date night and flowers. But that's all agency. That's all agency. I think the structural explanations make a lot more sense. And that is both domestic and international. Domestically, I don't believe, others will perhaps disagree, we can discuss this in Q&A. I think that the Trump election was not unlike Brexit, as people have pointed out, in other elections. It was a strong vote of no confidence in the elite, in the purveyors of facts, in think tanks and universities and the media, in the bi-coastal elite. But it was not fundamentally about foreign policy. And if you look at German Marshall Fund or Chicago Council on Global Affairs, the best polling on American foreign policy, you find that over half of Americans, Pew is a bit of an outlier for other reasons, but in most of those other polls, you find for some time now, about 5-6 years, a majority of Americans say Asia is the most important region to our country's future. And it used to be Europe. For decades in these polls, it was Europe. That's significant. A majority of Americans support free trade. It went down in the 2008-9 financial crisis, but then went up during the election. A majority of Americans supported free trade. Every one of the 50 governors, I'm sure, even if they don't say it publicly, supports the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. Polling in general on our alliances with Japan and Korea and Australia are the strongest they've been. And polling in those countries is interesting. It's very strong, too, even if there are negative polls about the new president, as is the case with the Lowy poll last summer, where close to 90% of Australians said they supported or strongly supported the U.S.-Australia alliance, but over 50% expressed negative views of Donald Trump as a candidate. So in terms of structure domestically, there's pretty robust support if someone wants to lead the American public to pull together these institutions and interest groups. China's more interesting. The German Marshall Fund and Pew and Chicago Council polls on China have shifted a bit. A majority of Americans a few years ago, a narrow majority, said China's more of a partner than an adversary in the Chicago Council polls. The last poll that flipped, and now a majority say adversary, not partner. But when in other Chicago Council polls, people are asked, so what do we do about China? Less than 10% of Americans choose containment. Less than 10% choose accommodation. The largest answer is engage China while staying close to our allies. Pretty, the think tank work is not that hard in a way. It's pretty basic. The specifics get complicated. And I remember reading this. I have a proud history of working on a string of failed Republican presidential campaigns. McCain was fun. Romney, a little less fun. But and then Jeb Bush. And then when I co-chaired his Asia group, and then when he bowed out, went to Marco Rubio. And then when he bowed out, some of the Kasich people approached me, and I told them I'm a jinx, and they don't want me. Although I have a lot of respect for Governor Kasich. But the most telling moment for me was in this whole thing was in 2012 in October, when it was Romney versus Obama, and the foreign policy people, and the Asia people specifically, and the really powerful people, the pollsters and political operatives who were coming up with a strategy, got together to talk about Ohio, the state of Ohio, which is critical in any election. So a certain member of the Asia team, not me, said, we need to hit China harder on currency. The Governor Romney had said he would name China a currency manipulator on day one, which most of us thought was fine because it doesn't actually do anything. But so somebody said to this group as we were brainstorming about Ohio, I went to Kenyon College in Ohio, so I'm qualified to talk about it, I guess. But somebody said we ought to hit China even harder on currency. And the domestic people who are completely cynical and Machiavellian and just want to get the vote out said, no, we don't want to do that. Because whenever the governor hits China hard on economic issues, the support among our base goes down in Ohio because of soybean exports. And interestingly, because the voters in that state associate a trade war with Japan as a trade war with Asia, and some of the best jobs in Ohio are Japanese and Korean manufacturers. And that may be a little bit less. There's less domestic support. There's much more dissatisfaction among the business community about their operations in China, intellectual property rights. It's more complicated, but I think it's still largely true about U.S.-China relations, that a trade war would be extremely unpopular in the very places that Donald Trump succeeded in winning away from the blue camp, from Hillary Clinton. So I think, I did a little blog saying this, and somebody, tweeted that Green says the swamp will win. It's not that clean. It's not that easy. We've had disruptive populist presidents before. But I do think that structure matters. And I don't see much in the election of Donald Trump or in his cabinet or in his immediate family, the exception being Steve Bannon, perhaps, who we can talk about, or Peter Navarro, people like that. But I don't see a sort of groundswell of anti-Asianism. And in fact, if you look at people, particularly Steve Bannon, who's controversial but is clearly loves to read history, he invokes or evokes a lot of the language of the America Firsters. And when David Sanger interviewed then-candidate Donald Trump, and then David said, your policy sounds like America First, and Donald Trump, steeped in history, having read every one of Warren Cohen's books, and said, yes, that's right. But people in the room from the New York Times said it sounded like he just associated America and the word first and went with it. I think Steve Bannon knows exactly what the America First movement was, and I should be advertising my book. Please buy it. But there's another great book I'm just finishing called Those Angry Days, a wonderful book about the history of the America First movement. It's about 2 years old. And how, the internationalists, who were then called the interventionists, dealt with the isolationists and how they organized and the themes. It's just very, very familiar sounding in March 2017. And then it wasn't bi-coastal elite, it was the East Coast elite. It was a connection with Europe. It was a connection with Britain. It was Midwestern Americans, many of whom 2-3 generations before were Germans or Czechs or Poles or Irish, who were deeply suspicious of the old world, deeply suspicious of Britain, coupled with the experience of the First World War, and you could draw some parallels to Iraq perhaps, but very evocative of that. But the other thing about the America First movement was it was anti-war and it was anti-Europe. It was not profoundly anti-Asia, and the sort of America First movement, I think, the DNA is strongly connected to what became the Asia First anti-NATO, anti-Europe, MacArthur, Taft movement after the war. And I think in some ways that's the DNA of Mr. Bannon, who I think knows his history. Maybe he abuses it. That's bad for Europe. If I were a European ambassador, I'd be much more worried. I think in Asia, like the American public, the administration probably sees the future. Let me just conclude by saying, to quote Yogi Berra, prediction is difficult, especially about the future. I don't know what's going to happen with the administration. It could go any number of ways. It could be quite debilitating. They could find their sea legs. Secretary Tillerson and Mattis, National Security Advisor McMaster's could really start adding some discipline, or not. Or we could go from tweet to tweet with the public and our allies confused. I don't know which way it will go. I tend to be more optimistic that over time, and maybe soon, who knows, it'll start to move in a better and more predictable direction. I just conclude by pointing to sort of evidence for both scenarios. And this is coming from someone who is to my wife's great delight, because I won't have to go into government now, was a critic of what the president was saying as a candidate. But consider three things that are actually probably, from the perspective of some of our friends in Asia, an improvement over the Obama administration, even if the public across the region is pretty negative about our current president. I can tell you, and from interacting with people around the Conte, around Prime Minister Abe, they are much more comfortable dealing with sort of hard-headed ideological conservatives who believe in hard power than they were with the Obama leadership team. Not Hillary Clinton, but the outgoing team of the Obama administration. That's maybe not where the media is in Japan or the public, but I can tell you, I'm quite sure of this. That's where people around Abe are. They feel a certain simpatico, but also they recognize that the hard power that they felt was missing in dealing with China and North Korea. China, I mean, Xi Jinping comes in a few weeks. It's going to be, any summit meeting with the U.S. these days is a bit like Russian roulette. There's one bullet in there. You hope you're not Malcolm Turnbull and getting that bullet. But you have 5 and 6 chance of getting through it okay, and maybe even like Abe, having a quite successful and influential summit. But for China and U.S.-China relations, I was in Beijing. A lot of you travel frequently to Beijing and talk to people in the party leadership and the foreign ministry and scholars. Very careful about Donald Trump. Very careful. The 19th Party Congress in the fall, not a time to pick a gratuitous fight with an American president who's a bit unpredictable. That's kind of how they were with Ronald Reagan, frankly. And although Ronald Reagan really upset the Asia scholars by promising as a candidate to renormalize relations with Taiwan, and although Ronald Reagan had over a year of debilitating internal fights about China and Taiwan, think about what happened next. 1982, third communique. And then Chinese leaders came into the Oval Office. This is in my new book, available nowhere else. George Shultz told me this on the record. And thanked the president for the third communique and said, now we have to do something about the Taiwan Relations Act. And Ronald Reagan said, yes, we do. We have to toughen it up. And it barely came up again. And if you think about 1982 to 1988, they were some of the most productive years in U.S.-China relations. And by 1988, we were selling weapons to China. So there may be, I don't want to overdo this or give too much credit, but there's a little bit, there may be something to be said for a bit of unpredictability initially in U.S.-China relations. I don't think you can sustain U.S.-China relations, let alone allies, if your creed is to be unpredictable. But initially, at least the historical record shows, things actually turn out a little better in the long run. That's what happened with George W. Bush in a way. And then the defense budget. I mean, the defense budget has been one of the missing pillars of the rebalance or pivot to Asia. On the other hand, I'm ending on a negative note, there are some big, big questions that I can't answer. We could talk about it. How much does the president's tweeting and image undercut American foreign policy? I would argue it is right now. Can he get out of that? Will a man of his age stop doing what he's been doing for a long time? A majority of Americans in polls say stop tweeting. So that's just not clear. The devastating cuts to the State Department, which are proposed, I think Congress will put most of the money back, but also the inability of Secretary Tillerson to staff his State Department, the ongoing personnel wars with the White House, that's a problem. And if it continues, it's going to be a really big problem. And then the complete lack of a trade strategy. No interest at all right now in an offensive, and I mean that in a defense offense. So, a lot of interest in USTR in punitive tariffs and duties for dumping and things coming into the U.S., CFIUS, investment strength protections and things. Almost no interest in, clearly no interest in TPP, but also no interest in the bilateral investment treaty with China. So no strategy at all to sort of open markets, improve rules. So those are big, big question marks that I'd end on, just so you don't think I've gone soft. Thanks.
15 minutes?
Sure, whatever you want.
Mike has agreed to take some questions for about 15 minutes. I'll let him field the questions. The protocol is wait for the mic, identify yourself and your affiliation, and keep your question short. You can tell he's a really smart guy. You don't have to give a whole paragraph to get the question across.
Do I call on him? Yeah. So I don't have to call on Wu Jinbo? No, Jinbo?
Thank you, Mike. I'm glad that you do not regret over signing the letter. You talk about structure and agency. The Republican Party, we were told, is structured on two wings, commercial and national security. So for the George W. Bush administration, I think in the early days, the national security wing had more influence over its foreign policy. Now, your observation, which wing is more influential with the Trump administration at this stage?
I haven't checked the news. I assume the healthcare bill has not passed yet. I mean, a lot of it comes down. You're here at an interesting time. If this healthcare bill passes, and it probably will by 1 or 2 votes, then a major Republican civil war will be averted. And if it fails, it's going to be quite destructive for the president and for the Congress. So we'll know the answer to your question before you leave. The one thing I think I can answer is, on Asia policy, there is almost no debate among Republicans in Congress, and very little debate at all between Republicans and Democrats. Asia policy is probably the area of foreign policy where there's the most consensus, which was not always the case. And one of the things that's quietly happening is that Republicans in the Congress, not just the very visible ones like John McCain, but also the chairman of the Asia Subcommittee, Cory Gardner, or Dan Sullivan from Alaska. There's a very almost unprecedented cadre of somewhat younger Republicans who've been elected to the Senate who have backgrounds in Asia and care about Asia. And they are quietly preparing to legislate and do other things to restore the State Department's capabilities, development, women's empowerment, and trade even. So Senator McCain has proposed an Asia Reassurance Initiative, which would be increasing the defense budget in Asia by about $1.5 billion a year for mostly operations. But the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is now working with McCain's blessing to find a development, diplomacy, trade piece. It won't involve $1.5 billion probably, but they're riding that pro-defense wave. So a lot of, I think the Republicans in the Congress and Republicans in the cabinet, Mattis, Tillerson, people like that, very much have common cause. And I think you'll start to see that. Yeah.
Yes, Mike, thank you. Secretary Tillerson went, Nadia Chow with the Liberty Times. Secretary Tillerson went to Beijing and drove fire in Washington about, his reaffirm of the phrases by Chinese about the new type power relationship. Do you agree that, the Trump administration is not really ready for a summit? Based on your experience, what should be prepared? What's the most important things before the summit? And some Korean and Japanese diplomats feel like they if the Trump administration is willing to endorse this new type of power, they feel like it being stabbed on the back when they were cornered right now by Chinese on the diplomatic front. Do you think that will make the Asian country to recalculate their balance? Thank you.
I think the administration is unprepared for a Xi Jinping visit in April, and I think they should do it. I mean, I look back in May 2004, 2003, I'm forgetting when Roh Moo-hyun was inaugurated. But when Roh Moo-hyun came to power, we had a summit within about 2 months in Washington. We were not prepared. I mean, I did a lot of work. Steve Hadley and Condi did a lot of work to get ready, but we didn't know what Roh Moo-hyun's policies really were going to be. The big highlight of the summit was that President Bush told Roh Moo-hyun he doesn't plan on attacking North Korea. It turned out that was Roh Moo-hyun's big ask. So that was pretty easy. It turned out not bad, actually. Huge credit to Kathy Moon, actually, who was at Brookings, who quietly coached me, because I'm on the right a little bit, how the left on Korea thinks about the U.S. And she was a really big help. She was at Wellesley at the time. So we weren't ready, but it was a good thing we did it. And I think it'd be a monumental mistake to just keep putting off a summit with Xi Jinping until the administration knows what its China policy is going to be, because I don't think they're going to get there. I think the summit is going to force some decisions on this. So I think they should do it. And in terms, the Washington Post asked me to write a piece, and it's online, about what Secretary Tillerson said in Asia. And I don't know if you saw it, Chris Nelson, I saw sent it around, so you may have seen it there, but I thought it was a mistake to use the four non-confrontation, win-win stuff, but a minor mistake compared to had he, embraced new model of great power relations. I don't think he should do that again. I think it's a mistake to be using China's 2 or 4 character phrases because they mean something different within China and within Asia. And, Condi Rice used to say, we want a balance of power in Asia that favors freedom. I would have been thrilled if Hu Jintao had used that language, but that would not be a basis for consistent China policy towards the U.S. And in the same way, using Chinese 2, 4, 6 character phrases is not a basis for maintaining domestic support and continuity in U.S.-China relations. So it was a mistake, but it wasn't a huge mistake. I think it's a symptom of 2 things. One, the lack of staffing at the State Department still. And number 2, the lack of consensus within the administration on China policy. And so a Xi visit may be a little rough and bumpy. Both sides, though, have a stake in making it come out well. And if you put it off, it's just going to get worse. It's just the debates will be disconnected from one very important part of the relationship, which is China. It'll be an inside the Beltway debate. Get Xi Jinping here and talk to an actual Chinese leader and sort it out. Yes, sir. Right.
Thank you. I'm Mike Larkin from the Forum on International Affairs. And since you mentioned balance of power in favor of freedom, assuming all the democracy and human rights programs are not completely gutted, what opportunities do you think exist for the U.S. to try to speak or act a bit more loudly on, democratic regression in Southeast Asia and in Asia in general, wherever it's found? Thank you.
So I should, I tried to have balance, 3 things about the Trump administration that actually parts of Asia prefer, and 3 things that they don't. I tried to have 3 and 3. The second list that would have been much longer had I had the time, and the 4th one I would have put is the very confusing, if not negative, signal we're sending about good governance, democracy, women's empowerment, human rights. It's not one issue; it's a basket of issues. They're all. The way you approach them is a bit different, but it does not help that the way the administration is treating the press. It does not help that the president never raised this, that he's talked about moral equivalency in effect with Russia. That said, when I mentioned Republicans in the Congress earlier, you can be sure that people like Marco Rubio or Cory Gardner or John McCain or pretty much any Republican in the Senate, and I think almost all in the House, will protect the quote-unquote freedom agenda, what George Bush used to call the freedom agenda, because it's important to them personally. And their view, I can tell you, and I'm sure others here have talked to some of these members of Congress, their view is it's an indispensable part of our foreign policy. But it's going to be a little bit harder, you know, when the commander-in-chief is not articulating the message. And you know, we're going to have to work around that for exactly the reasons you said. I think you hit the right target, too. If you were to pick something as sort of the focus, I think the U.S. should always speak out on behalf of dissidents, always. And we should always speak out on behalf of women's empowerment. We should speak out on behalf of good governments. But the thing that I would make the target right now, which I think Secretary Tillerson would find attractive, is the closing civil society space everywhere, which means don't cut the budget for the East-West Center and the Asia Foundation and things like that, which in aggregate costs less than the Secret Service bill for, well. Yeah.
Mike Macetic, PBS Online NewsHour. Can you set the table, please, for our next discussion? Are our options as bad and as limited with North Korea as they seem?
Yes. Seriously, yes. And they have been for a while. And one thing I thought Rex Tillerson did really well was go out and say 20 years of diplomacy engagement have not worked. And he's not saying we're going to attack North Korea. He said we're going to have to keep all options on the table. I tell you, I think that's what Hillary Clinton or Jeb Bush would have said right now. Because, and I've been doing this North Korea. I've personally solved, Victor Cha and I joke, we've personally solved the North Korea problem 5 times each. And we were big advocates of engagement. I think it's pretty obvious, I don't oppose some level of diplomatic contact, but it's pretty obvious we have to approach this differently and get away from the lines every administration, including ours, used, which is North Korea is only isolating itself, we're going to have strategic patience. That said, there is, I think, basically no option to get Kim Jong-un to stop his programs in the near term. There's not enough we can give him to bribe him, and an all-out military option is ugly, although we have to keep all options on the table given his unclear intentions and capabilities. So my own view is we're going at second best strategies for the time being, which is enhancing deterrence, missile defense, enhancing defense, and enhancing interdiction, which is not only stronger UN Security Council sanctions, but more effective interdiction. And if I don't know what, I mean, I think Secretary Tillerson in private was pretty tough with his Chinese counterparts. I'm pretty sure of that. But if I had a big ask of the Chinese side, it would be on interdiction, which can have a specific, now, when people, Green doesn't have a solution for the North Korea problem. I'm sorry, I don't think anyone does. But this would help us mitigate the risk better.
We could probably ask Mike Green questions all afternoon, but he has a day job. And we have our North Korea panel, just to reconfirm that all the options are awful. But I want to thank you for taking the time. It's really good, and you taught us some stuff, and I think we should all buy your book.
Good.
So please join me in thanking Mike.